right, folks, this is another one in a series of white supremacy losing empire. And this is one of the underpinnings of the United States power. White thinks it's the military. Some people think it's the economy, which is true. But the biggest underpinning of the United States global power is actually the dollar. And this is from, of all places, this is from the Wall Street Journal. The dollar underpins American power. Rivals are building workarounds, which is something that I've been talking about probably since I've gotten on YouTube. It's something we talked about way back in 2009 when China was actually formulating plans to actually replace the infrastructure of the global financial infrastructure we call the dollar system, or the modified Bretton Woods. Iran sanctions spur Europe and India to devise systems to trade with Tehran without using the U.S. currency. The new arrangements won't change the dollar's dominance in global trade, but they will diminish the U.S.'s power to impose policies. U.S. allies looking to buck American control over international trade are developing alternative systems that don't rely on U.S. currency. The catalyst was the Trump administration's decision last year to reimpose trade sanctions on Iran after pulling out of the 2015 nuclear weapons deal. The UK, Germany, and France didn't support the sanctions, which included ban on dollar transactions with Iranian banks. So they are fine-tuning a system to enable companies to trade with Iran without using dollars. India wasn't happy about it either. Iran is a longtime trading partner. They buy most of their oil from Iran. And India wants Iranian oil. They've been doing it for a long time. Originally, under the old sanctions, India was actually using gold to actually facilitate the trade. And when they took the sanctions off, they went more to a conventional method. But now they're back to developing their own system. India began using a similar alternative system in November. The shipping records show it already is being used by international companies to trade with Iranian business subject to sanctions. China and Russia are also eager to break free of U.S. control. They are promoting their own alternatives to the global bank transfer system, which the U.S. effectively controls, and are striking deals to trade with yuan and rubles instead of dollars. And, like I said, China's been doing it since 2009. I think Russia just started doing it back in 2016, I do believe. Global trade runs on dollars, giving the U.S. extraordinary power over nearly every entity that imports or exports anything, anywhere. That cloud has long frustrated America's enemies, making them vulnerable to U.S. trade sanctions. Believe it or not, I was actually reading Gold, Dollars, and Power, and that is how they got Great Britain and France out of Egypt and Syria, because they threatened to crash their economies if they didn't. So this has been a very, very old process. The new arrangements won't change the dollar's dominance in global trade, but they will diminish the U.S.'s power to impose its policies. Including sanctions around the globe. They also could make it easier for criminals and terrorists who have long tried to sidestep the dollar to move money outside of U.S. oversight. Man, they've been doing that for God knows how long. It's not about crooks. They don't care about crooks. But they do care about the dollar system, because that's how the United States keeps its money, keeps its wealth. But that is a long lesson to teach. because any financial architecture is very complex, and to explain it takes a while. It took me a long time to learn it. The White House has declined to comment about efforts by other countries to bypass dollar-denominated trading. A senior administration official said the U.S. is working to make sure oil is readily available in dollar-denominated markets from sources other than Iran to bring Iran's oil exports to zero. That's why you see all this fracking in the United States who actually want to keep trade going, but the thing is, take the place of places like Iran and Venezuela that actually export oil. Look, we'll focus on this chart right here. You can see, what is it, 80% of 80% of all global transactions actually done in dollars, and in euros is what, like I said, 25%. Yen, British pounds. You see China all the way down here. It's going to take a while, but China is just really starting to test out its infrastructure. They're going to accelerate pretty fast, but right now, the U.S. is the only game in town. This is what Venezuela is finding out. In congressional testimony in March, Treasury Department Undersecretary Sigel Mandelker, how do you spell that? How do you say that? Said that those who engage in activities that run afoul of U.S. sanctions risk severe consequences, including losing access to the U.S. financial system and the ability to do business with the United States. Jacob J. Lew, Treasury Secretary under President Obama, says the U.S. is at risk of losing some of its power, some of the power it has long wielded. The world, he says, now has pathways for those who need or want to avoid the United States. The dollar status dates back to the end of World War II. It's when Bretton Woods was actually created, when the U.S. economy was the world's most robust and dollars were plentiful, because everything else was blown up. And we also were on the gold standard at the time, too. The currency's liquidity and the efficient U.S. banking system anchored by the Federal Reserve mean trading in dollars is much less expensive and more convenient than using other currencies, says Craig Pirong, a University of Houston professor who studies payment systems. That's probably why they're trying to keep Bitcoin and other cryptocurrencies at bay, because the cryptocurrency is actually cheaper. Here's how it works. A Canadian lumber company sells boards to a French buyer. The buyer's bank in France and the seller's bank in Canada settle the payment in dollars via correspondent banks that have accounts at the Fed. The money is transferred seamlessly between the banks. The bank's Fed accounts, because their status as a correspondent banks means they are seen as safe counterparties. The use of these accounts, the U.S. says, means every transaction technically touches U.S. soil, giving it legal jurisdiction, because using most other currencies is relatively inconvenient and expensive. Many countries and companies will do whatever the U.S. requires to maintain access to dollars. That's how come when places like Argentina and some African countries, currency goes afoul because they don't have access to dollars and they can't facilitate trade. So when the dollar goes up or up in value, that means that the currencies relative to the dollar go down, and it costs them more money. It costs them more money to actually bring import and export. Tensions over the Iran nuclear deal have ratcheted up recently, with Iran threatening to abandon some of its commitments if it doesn't realize certain economic benefits. The foreign ministers of the UK, Germany, and France In a joint statement, it expressed concerns and rejected Iran's ultimatum. An unraveling of the deal could affect Europe's plans for rolling out Instex, the name of its new system. And this is a diagram of Europe's dollar-free system. A new system called Instex, designed to facilitate trade between Europe and Iran without sending money across borders. Say number one, company A sends. A company in Europe agrees to buy. A company in Europe agrees to sell medicine to a buyer in Iran. Another European company agrees to import pistachios from Iran. Companies notify Instex in Europe and its Iranian counterpart. Both parts of Instex then pay the local exporter with cash from the local importer. The money never crosses any borders, avoiding U.S. scrutiny. If the numbers don't match, Instex uses funds from other transactions or from its own capital. India's system is being used already, although it is supposed to facilitate trade involving only non-sanctioned entities and goods. A Wall Street Journal review of Indian customs records shows it is allowing companies to trade with Iranian entities named on the U.S. sanctions list. On January 24th, Punjab Bevel Gears Limited, a parts manufactured in Ghaziabad, India, sent nearly $71,000 of tractor components to Iran Tractor Manufacturing Company. Treasury classifies the company as a specifically designated global terrorist, and it says it can sanction any company anywhere in the world that trades with the Iranian company. Iran Tractor didn't respond to a request for comment. Now, how does a tractor company get designated as a global terrorist? Anyway, Mohan Singh, who handles exports for Punjab Bevel Gears, says his company got paid through India's payment mechanism. He said he wasn't concerned that the buyer is on the sanctions list because the Indian government has allowed export to Iran. That's what we are doing. The European effort may be the most serious threat to the U.S. dominance. I want Europe to be a sovereign continent, not a vassal. Not a vassal. That means having totally independent financing instruments. French Finance Minister Bruno Le Maire said at a press conference last year. In an op-ed around the same time, German Foreign Minister Heiko Maas wrote that it is essential that we strengthen European autonomy by establishing payment channels independent of the U.S. The French are the reason that we are out on the gold standard. They have never liked being under the U.S. Bretton Woods system. But that is a video for a different day. Planning in Europe began after the U.S. threatened sanctions against SWIFT, the Belgium-based system that banks use to communicate with each other about money movements, unless it cut off Iran's banks. In response, Germany, France, and the UK decided to set up Instex, an acronym for the Instrument in Support of Trade Exchanges. The system isn't operational. The system, which is in operation, will be based on the euro, the second most used currency in international trade. Initially, it will allow for the trade with Iran of goods not covered by the new U.S. sanctions, such as consumer products and medicine. It is needed because U.S. sanctions bar dollar transactions with Iranian banks, even on deals for unsanctioned goods. Once operational, Instex members could expand to cover any trade with Iran. Vice President Mike Pence told a conference in February that European countries were trying to break American sanctions against Iran's murderous revolutionary regime. Officials in Europe say they need to create incentives to honor earlier deals with Iran. The system aims to bypass the dollar by using the same mechanism underlying the age-old Hawala money transfer system popular in the Middle East and Asia, under which people pay cash in one office and recipient draws the equivalent funds at a distant locale without money actually moving. That's how our banking system got set up in the first place, because the Templars copied this this Hawala money transfer system a long time ago. That's where your fractional reserve system actually came from this very same thing. The Templars actually copied it. This is how the Instex system would handle the sale of medicine by a German company to an Iranian buyer. The German exporter wouldn't get paid by the buyer by another European company that is separately importing goods from Iran. Similarly, in Iran, the buyer of the medicine would pay the exporter of the other goods. No dollars at all would be involved, which means the U.S. would have no jurisdiction. Instex incorporates a sovereign shield that puts government officials who can't be prosecuted by the U.S. in the top positions, which protects individual bankers from U.S. pressure. And they don't want to fly to the U.S. and get picked up by the DOD or the FBI. While the European initiative is focused on bypassing the Iran sanctions, China's effort is broader. It has struck deals under which countries, including Turkey and Pakistan, have agreed to sell goods to China in exchange for yuan. Last year, it did a currency swap with Nigeria to reduce the need for dollars in bilateral deals. It established a yuan-based system that enables Serbians to use their local credit cards in other countries. African countries have been begging them to actually use yuan-based capital. What's more we got? Let's read it. It's almost 20 minutes. Even if such alternative systems catch on, the dollar is likely to dominate international trade for years to come. In 2016, the most recent year for which data is available, the dollar was involved in 88% of the daily trades in the $5 trillion per day foreign currency market, according to the Bank for International Settlements, an international institution owned by central banks. The euro is handicapped by political uncertainty in Europe and the yuan by Chinese restrictions on currency flows, which is true, and unease about the nation's economy. Further bolstering the dollar's standing is its role in the world's main reserve currency, held by central banks globally. This creates a strong incentive to keep the currency stable and liquid. The rest of the world can't do without the U.S. dollar, says Daniel Dresner. The U.S. has used, this is key, the U.S. has used that power to force foreign countries to abide by its laws on money laundering and corruption. After 9/11, it used its control of the dollar to increase surveillance of global money flows and curbing financing for terrorist organizations or for expats that are trying to flee with their money. That began a shift toward using the dollar to further U.S. policy goals. They're using the dollar more and more as a weapon. North Korea, Syria, Al-Qaeda were mostly cut off from the global financial system by the U.S. sanctions. Policymakers use the U.S. control of the dollar to try to cutting off funds for despotic regimes, would-be nuclear powers, and rivals intent on undermining elections in democratic countries, such as Venezuela. Tensions have arisen over big U.S. fines against companies seen as important in their own countries. Even with the risk of fines, though, the high cost of alternative transactions meant avoiding the dollar was hardly worth it. In other words, they'd rather pay the fine even though they don't think it's fair rather than not do business. Here it goes. Even Bitcoin has failed to catch on as a large-scale substitute because of cryptocurrency volatility, which is bullshit. They actually purposely tried to kill Bitcoin. India's alternative system is similar in concept to Europe's, though it is used now only for trade involving Iranian oil, for which the U.S. gave India a temporary waiver. In April, the U.S. said it would end the waiver. India has stopped direct purchases of Iranian oil, or at least temporarily, the journal has reported this week. Aja Sehe, CEO of the Federation of Indian Exporting Organization, says that India is on track to export some $3.5 billion in goods to Iran this year, about 25% higher than last year. He said he hopes that the Indian government can convince the U.S. of our need to import oil from Iran so that Indian exporters can continue selling to Iran. While the system is designed to facilitate only trade involving non-sanctioned entities, Mr. Sahai says Indian exporters must rely on the word of Iranian counterparts for how products will be used, presenting a risk of goods being sold to parties who are subject to sanctions. Yeah, I'm going to read this last little bit. Color lawyer Jeanette Kim says the practical reality is that most banks won't process such transactions because of their fear of doing any business with Iran. So Colorcon got paid through India's payment mechanism. In theory, says Colorcon General Counsel Bruce Reed, the company should have received payment in dollars or any other currency. In practice, though, it appears that only one that's effective trading now is in rupees, he says. In other words, they got caught just a little $9,000 in drugs, and they got slammed. But the U.S. has been using the dollar for a weapon for a very long time. And with Trump in office, they have kind of ratcheted that up. So when you see, say, Venezuela or Iran or North Korea or any one of a number of other countries actually having currency problems or economic problems, it's normally because the U.S. is actually strangling them through the banking system. So they can't trade. It costs them more to actually trade, to actually sell their goods or also import goods, because there's a risk of counterparties actually doing it. And they actually do it through the trade of gold is actually very expensive. But I thought that I would drop that in, because eventually what's going to happen is that the other countries, which they are getting tired of it, are going to find workarounds, as we see that they're doing right now. But it's going to take a while. But they said it back then that it wouldn't be till 2030 that you actually see somebody like China or somebody else actually overtake the U.S. dollar and actually put them as a secondary reserve currency. But not today. Anyway, folks, hope you guys got something out of that. I don't know if you did or not, because there's probably a lot of background material that probably needs to be added to this. I understand it. Somebody like Nagom wouldn't understand it, but well, that's just me and him, because we've done this for quite a long time. But I'm gonna close this out. It's getting long. This is BG is out, and I will see you guys on the next one. Peace.